I've always believed that childhood memories are sacred, frozen in time like fragile artifacts. For me, one memory has always stood apart: a simple wooden treehouse, nestled high in the branches of an old oak, built with my father's hands. It was my refuge, a place where I felt untouchable, safe. The rain tapping gently on the roof, the creak of the ladder as I climbed up, the way the world below seemed to disappear. All of it felt timeless. But memories can deceive you. Sometimes, the details you don't remember are the ones that matter most. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Also, leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Now, back to my story. I was 11 when it happened. At the time, I thought I understood that treehouse better than anyone. Every loose nail, every carved initial in the wood, every shadow cast by its walls. I thought it was mine, and mine alone. But looking back now, I'm not so sure anymore. There was something about it, something I didn't see back then, something I never wanted to believe could be real. And on that night, as the rain came down in sheets and the wind howled through the trees, I realized the truth about that treehouse. It wasn't just mine, and it wasn't just a treehouse. What I'm about to tell you is not a story I've shared with anyone before. Even now, part of me wonders if it's better left buried with the rest of my childhood. But the more I try to forget, the harder it becomes to silence the memories. The whispers, the things I saw, or thought I saw, that night. Maybe you'll understand why I kept this to myself for so long. Or maybe, by the end, you'll wish I hadn't told you at all. This is the story of the night everything changed. The night I learned the truth about the treehouse and what was waiting inside. It started like any other rainy evening. My sister Lena and I had spent the afternoon playing in the treehouse, laughing and arguing the way siblings do, while the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm didn't seem like anything unusual, not at first. In fact, it was the rain that made the treehouse feel even more magical. Up there, surrounded by the sound of water hitting the roof, we felt untouchable, separated from the world below. We were so used to that little wooden box high up in the oak tree that we never thought to question it. To us, it was just ours. But thinking back now, maybe there were signs even before that night. Things I should have noticed. The way that would always seem damp no matter how dry the air was. The strange carvings etched into the floorboards. Names, dates, symbols. Things I thought were left by other kids who had climbed into the tree before us. Lena always said she felt like someone was watching us up there. I laughed at her then. I wish I hadn't. That evening, as the rain poured harder, we decided to stay in the treehouse a little longer. The wind rattled the branches, and the sky turned darker. Lena had brought an old flashlight, and its beam cut through the dim interior like a knife. I remember staring at the walls, tracing the familiar grooves in the wood, when something felt off. I didn't know it then, but we had already stayed too long. We should have left as soon as the rain started, because that night, for the first time, the treehouse felt different. It didn't feel like ours anymore. There's a reason I've held on to this story all these years, why it stayed with me long after the treehouse itself disappeared. It's not just what happened that night that's haunted me. It's the realization that I can't explain it. No matter how many times I replay it in my mind, no matter how much I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, one truth remains. What we found that night was real. Stay with me until the end. I'll tell you everything. The sounds we heard, the things we saw, and what we found hidden in the shadows of that treehouse. But I warn you, once you know, you can't unhear it, unsee it, or forget it. Because some places are meant to be left alone, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Our backyard wasn't anything special, at least not to anyone else. It was a simple patch of grass bordered by a sagging wooden fence, a few overgrown bushes, and the massive oak tree that towered over it all. That tree was ancient, its bark rough and gnarled like weathered hands reaching into the sky. Its roots bulged out of the ground, creating small hills in the earth, and its branches spread wide, casting deep shadows over the yard even on the brightest of days. To me and Lena, it was the heart of our little world. The treehouse had been there for as long as I could remember. My dad built it when I was 5, just after Lena turned 8. He always said it was our kingdom in the clouds. It wasn't much, just a few planks of wood nailed into the tree with a small ladder leading up. But to us, it was everything. We spent countless afternoons up there, pretending to be explorers, knights, pirates, anything we could imagine. We etched our initials into the walls, made up secret passwords, and hid treasures that only we could find. On rainy days, the treehouse felt different. The air seemed cooler, heavier, and the shadows inside stretched longer. Lena always joked that the treehouse had a life of its own. "It's watching us," she'd say, her voice low and dramatic, and I'd laugh, calling her a scaredy cat. But even then, I think part of me believed her. There were little things I ignored at the time, that made me wonder, like how the walls always seemed damp, no matter how dry it had been, or how the ladder creaked louder at night, even when no one was climbing it. That evening, as the rain began to fall harder, Lena and I were already in the treehouse. We climbed up after dinner, armed with a flashlight and an old deck of cards. I remember the smell of wet wood and the faint scent of the rain-soaked leaves around us. The treehouse felt cozy at first, like it always did. We sat cross-legged on the floor, the flashlight propped up between us, its beam casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind whistled through the branches, and the rain tapped a steady rhythm against the roof. Lena dealt the cards, her face lit by the dim flashlight. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, looking up from the game. I shook my head. "It's just the rain," I said, but she didn't look convinced. She tilted her head, listening. "No," she said, "it's something else, like scratching." I laughed it off, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. "You're imagining things," I said, but now that she'd mentioned it, I could hear it too, a faint scraping sound, barely audible over the rain. It was coming from below us, near the base of the tree. I leaned over to peer through the gaps in the floorboards, but it was too dark to see anything. Lena shone the flashlight down, but the beam couldn't reach that far. "It's probably just an animal," I said, but my voice sounded unsure, even to me. Lena didn't respond. She was staring at the wall, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, and she pointed at something carved into the wood. I leaned closer, squinting to make out the letters. It wasn't one of our carvings. It wasn't even something I recognized. It was a name, Ethan. Beneath it was a date, barely legible, 1972. "Did you carve this?" Lena asked. I shook my head. "It must have been here before," I said, but the words felt hollow. We'd spent years in that treehouse. How had we never noticed it before? Lena ran her fingers over the letters, her expression unreadable. "Do you think someone else used to play here?" she asked. I shrugged, but I could feel a growing unease settling in my stomach. Something about the carving felt wrong, and then I saw it. The name scratched out beneath Ethan's, so violently that the wood splintered in places. Whoever had carved it hadn't wanted anyone to read what was there. We should have left then. We should have climbed down the ladder and run back to the house. But we didn't. We stayed, and as the rain poured harder and the wind rattled the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We sat in silence for a long time after finding the name, Ethan, the year 1972, and that other name beneath it, scratched out so violently it was impossible to read. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just some kid from years ago carving their name like we had. But Lena wouldn't let it go. "Why would someone scratch it out like that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about it. I just wanted to go back to playing cards and pretending everything was normal. But the treehouse didn't feel normal anymore. It felt wrong. That's when we heard it, the tapping. At first I thought it was just the rain hitting the roof, but it was too slow, too deliberate. 3 taps, then silence. Then 3 more. I froze, staring at Lena. She looked at me, wide-eyed, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "It's probably just the wind, or something," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. The tapping came again, louder this time, as if someone, or something, was knocking on the walls of the treehouse. I crawled to the edge of the room, peering through the small gap between the boards, but I couldn't see anything. The rain blurred everything below into a swirling gray mass. "Maybe it's an animal," I said, my voice trembling. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Animals don't knock. "Did you hear that?" "It's just the wind." "It has to be the wind," but we both knew it wasn't. The sound didn't come from outside. It came from below us, somewhere near the base of the tree. Lena grabbed the flashlight and shone it at the trapdoor in the floor, the one that led to the ladder. The light flickered as the storm raged outside, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound over the pounding rain. But the laughter was gone. Everything was silent now. Too silent. "Let's just go inside," I said, my voice breaking. But Lena wasn't ready to leave. She pointed the flashlight at the floorboards, her brow furrowed. "Tommy, look." At first, I didn't understand what she was pointing at. The light caught on something scratched into the wood. More carvings like the one we'd found earlier. But these were different. They weren't names or dates. They were symbols, circles, triangles, strange shapes that didn't make sense to me. Some of them were crude, barely recognizable. Others were so precise it was as if they'd been burned into the wood rather than carved. Lena traced one of the symbols with her finger, her face pale. "What do you think they mean?" she asked. I shook my head, my throat tightening. "I don't know," I said, "but I don't like it. Tommy, look at this." Her flashlight moved to another carving. A name. Ethan. The same one we'd seen earlier. But this one was deeper, more deliberate, as if whoever had carved it wanted to make sure it couldn't be erased. And beneath it, scratched so faintly it was almost invisible, was another word. "Help!" Lena pulled her hand back, as if the wood had burned her. We stared at each other, the rain hammering against the roof, the wind rattling the treehouse walls. I wanted to say something, to tell her it was just a prank or a coincidence. But before I could, the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from beneath the floor. We should have left. We should have run back to the house and told our parents. But we didn't. Instead, Lena grabbed the flashlight and reached for the trapdoor handle. "What are you doing?" I hissed, my heart pounding. She didn't answer. She just opened it. The moment Lena opened the trapdoor, the rain surged in, soaking the floorboards and sending a cold gust of wind spiraling up from below. She shone the flashlight into the darkness, the beam trembling in her hands. I leaned over her shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first, there was nothing, just the old ladder slick with rain, leading down to the yard below. But then, just as Lena moved the light, something caught my eye. It was quick, so quick I thought I might have imagined it, a flicker of movement in the shadows near the base of the tree. A shape, crouched low to the ground. I grabbed Lena's arm, pulling her back. "Close it," I whispered. "Close it now." "What did you see?" Lena asked, her voice shaking. I couldn't answer. I didn't know what I saw, only that it wasn't something I wanted to see again. We sat there, backs pressed against the far wall, too scared to speak. The rain hammered on the roof, and the wind made the whole treehouse creak as if it might come crashing down. But it wasn't just the storm that had us frozen. It was the shadows. They were moving. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. The beam of the flashlight cast strange shapes on the walls, twisting and bending with the wind. But the longer I watched, the more certain I became. They weren't just shadows. They were something else, something alive. They stretched across the walls, pooling in the corners and creeping closer with every flicker of the light. "Tommy," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned to look at her, and my stomach dropped. She wasn't looking at the walls. She was staring at the trapdoor. I followed her gaze, and that's when I heard it. It called her name, clear as day, even over the storm. I felt the blood drain from my face as I grabbed her arm. "We need to leave," I said, my voice cracking. She nodded. But before we could move, the voice came again. "Lena, come down." I scrambled to find the backup flashlight we always kept in the corner. But before I could, Lena gasped. "Tommy," she whispered, clutching my arm. "Look." I didn't want to. I didn't want to see. But I couldn't stop myself. I looked toward the gap in the wall where the wind was pushing through. And that's when I saw them. Eyes. Glowing. Yellow eyes staring at us through the cracks in the wood. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. And then, slowly, they disappeared, one by one, as if whatever they belonged to was crawling away. "We have to go," I said, my voice trembling. I reached for the trapdoor, but when I pulled it open, my heart sank. The ladder was gone. Not broken, not hanging down like it had fallen. It was gone, as if someone had pulled it up from below. We were trapped. What do we do? How do we get down? I didn't have an answer. The treehouse was nearly 10 feet off the ground. Jumping wasn't an option, not in the dark, not with whatever was out there waiting for us. The whispers grew louder, circling us, filling the small space until it felt like they were coming from inside my head. And then, over the noise, came the voice again, clearer this time, more insistent. "Lena, come down." Lena gripped my hand, her nails digging into my skin. "It's trying to get in," she said, her voice barely a whisper. And she was right. The shadows on the walls had gathered now, pooling around the edges of the trapdoor. The wood creaked and groaned under the weight of something pressing against it. The flashlight was dead, the ladder was gone, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. We were completely, utterly alone. I could barely breathe. The air inside the treehouse felt heavy, suffocating, as if the storm outside was trying to force its way in. The whispers were gone now, but the silence was worse. It wasn't the kind of silence you get when a storm settles. It was unnatural, a stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something was waiting, watching. Lena crouched next to me, gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. "It's going to be okay," she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. But I could tell she didn't believe it. Her hands were shaking, her face pale in the dim light. I wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that she could protect me like she always did. But I couldn't ignore the truth. We were trapped. "What if we can't get out, Lena?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer right away. She just stared at the trapdoor, as if willing it to stay closed. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "We will," she said. "I promise." But the way her voice cracked at the end made my stomach twist. She was scared too, maybe more than I was. For a long time, we didn't say anything. We just sat there, backs pressed against the wall, holding on each other like our lives depended on it. I thought about the times we'd played in the treehouse before, building forts, telling ghost stories, watching the sunset from the little window. It had always been our safe place, our escape. Now it felt like a prison. Lena broke the silence first. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We have to do something." I nodded, but I didn't know what. The ladder was gone, the storm was still raging, and whatever was outside, it was still there, waiting. "We could jump," I said finally, though the thought made my stomach turn. The ground was a long way down, and in the dark with the rain, it wasn't just dangerous. It was almost impossible. Lena shook her head. "No," she said. "It's too risky. We get hurt. Or worse. What if we just stay here? Maybe it'll go away. And what if it doesn't? What if it gets in?" Her face fell, and I hated myself for saying it. She was trying to be strong for me, trying to hold it together, and all I could do was fall apart. I wanted to tell her I was sorry, that I didn't mean it, but before I could, there was a sound, a single, deliberate knock on the trapdoor. We froze. Neither of us moved, barely even breathed. The knock came again, louder this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was below wanted to remind us it was still there. Lena reached for the flashlight, her hands trembling, but it was no use. The batteries were dead. We were in complete darkness now, save for the occasional flash of lightning. "We have to decide," Lena whispered. "Do we stay? Or do we jump?" I didn't know what to say. Both choices felt like the wrong one. If we stayed, we'd have to face whatever was out there. If we jumped, we might not survive the fall. What if it's already inside? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Lena looked at me, her face pale, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. "Don't say that," she said, her voice breaking. But we both knew it was a possibility. The shadows had moved. The whispers had surrounded us. And now, something was knocking. Whatever was out there wasn't going to let us go. The storm didn't stop all at once. It faded, slowly, the rain turning to a soft drizzle, the thunder retreating into the distance. But even as the storm weakened, our fear didn't. We sat there, backs pressed against the cold wood of the treehouse wall, too afraid to move or even speak. The last thing I remember is Lena's hand gripping mine, her voice a faint whisper in the darkness. "Don't let go," she said, "no matter what." I nodded, though I wasn't sure she could see me. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. The rain was gone, and the sky was clear, painted with soft hues of pink and gold. At first, I thought it was over, that the worst was behind us. But then I realized where I was. I wasn't in the treehouse anymore. I was lying on the ground, soaked to the bone, shivering as the early morning light filtered through the branches of the old oak. I sat up, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of it. Lena was next to me, still unconscious, her clothes just as soaked as mine. I shook her gently, my voice trembling. "Lena, wake up." When she finally opened her eyes, her face twisted in confusion. "What happened?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. All I could do was point. The treehouse was gone. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Just gone. The old oak tree stood there, its branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. But there was no sign of the treehouse. No ladder. No platform. Nothing. We stood there, staring up at the empty tree, our minds racing. It didn't make sense. We had been in the treehouse. We remembered the rain, the shadows, the whispers. It was real. It had to be real. And that's when we saw them. The names. The same names we'd found carved into the floorboards of the treehouse. Ethan 1972. Sarah 1981. Daniel 1994. And there, scratched in fresh, jagged letters, Lena, Tommy, our names, carved into the tree as if they had always been there. But it wasn't just the names. There were symbols too strange and twisted, the same ones we'd seen on the floorboards. They wrapped around the trunk of the tree, burned into the bark as if by something far older and far more powerful than we could understand. Lena backed away, her face pale, her breath shallow. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. We ran, leaving the tree behind, leaving the house behind. We didn't stop running until we reached the road, where a neighbor found us and took us home. We never went back. My parents sold the property a few months later, and I didn't ask any questions. I didn't want to know. But Lena couldn't let it go. It's been years since that night. I've done my best to forget, to push it down and pretend it never happened. But Lena, she couldn't. She was always the brave one, always the one who needed answers. So, when I got the call that she was going back to the property, I wasn't surprised. I begged her not to go, but she wouldn't listen. She told me she just wanted to see it, to put it behind her once and for all. She found the house abandoned, the windows shattered, the roof caved in. But the tree was still there, taller and darker than she remembered. She said it felt wrong, just being near it. The air was colder, the ground softer, as if the earth itself didn't want her there. But she stayed. She walked up to the tree, her heart pounding, and ran her fingers over the bark. She told me she heard it again. The voice. The same voice that had called to her that night. "Lena, come down." She didn't wait to hear it again. She ran, leaving the tree behind for good. She called me that night, her voice shaking, and told me everything. She swore she'd never go back, and I believe her. But sometimes late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I think about that old oak. I think about the names, the symbols, the whispers, and I wonder if it's still waiting. Years have passed, but the memory of that night lingers. It creeps in at unexpected moments, when I see an old tree swaying in the wind, or when I hear the rain tapping against my window. Sometimes I ask myself, did the treehouse ever really exist? Was it just a figment of our imagination, a fleeting dream born from the innocence of childhood and the chaos of the storm? Or was it something else? Something unimaginable that existed for a reason we were never meant to understand? And the names, I still can't explain them. Ethan, Sarah, Daniel, ours. Were they warnings? A record of those who had entered and never returned? Or were they simply waiting for the next name to be added to the tree's endless, unexplainable story? If this story kept you on edge, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think the symbols meant? Do you believe the treehouse was a doorway to something else? Or was it all in our minds? There are more stories like this, some darker, some stranger, waiting to be told. If you enjoy tales that blur the line between reality and the unimaginable, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Sleep well if you can.